Welcome to the Rejected Religion podcast. I'm Stephanie Shea. I'm happy to be back with you after a long forced hiatus due to voice issues. As you can probably hear, my voice is not completely healed, but I will be doing some voice therapy to tackle these last concerns, and I hope my voice won't be too raspy or distracting for you. This month's guest is Bob Cluness. Bob is a PhD candidate and researcher in the Cultural Studies program at the University of Iceland in Reykjavik. Bob graduated in 2017 with a bachelor's degree in film studies on accelerationist aesthetics and action cinema, while in 2020 he received a master's degree in cultural studies with a thesis on the weird and eerie in contemporary and digital cultures. His current PhD project deals with the relationship between esotericism and acceleration in UK subcultures in the late 20th century through a discursive analysis of chaos magic and the Cybernetic Cultures Research Unit, also known as CCRU. As part of his academic research, Bob's interests look at the myriad intersections between esotericism and contemporary subcultures such as cyberpunk, cyberspace, and technology, the counterculture and the New Age, comics, zine culture, and music. He has also given papers centered on Icelandic occulture and spiritual currents such as Ásatrú, spiritualism, and wellness. As you can tell from the episode title, Bob and I are talking about a little bit of everything. And while on the surface these things may seem unrelated, as the discussion unfolds, I hope it will become clear that all of these strands are indeed very much connected. As this was a long interview, I'm providing it to you in two parts. In part one, Bob begins by explaining the terms the weird and the eerie, and how these literary concepts have helped to fuel the social imagination, as well as the tricky issue of how one discerns between fiction and reality. With the help of philosophical concepts such as the hyperreal and simulacra, taken from Baudrillard, as well as other concepts from French philosophers such as Deleuze, Guattari, and Lyotard, Bob discusses the effects of signs, symbols, and other images on our understanding of what's quote-unquote real, as well as the dissolving boundaries between the real and the artificial. This all takes us into the area of hyperstition, the CCRU, and a case study that is a good example of a hyperstition found in the Slender Man character, and later incident in 2014 involving Slender Man, where two girls come to believe that he is a real entity, attempting to kill their friend because of it. Bob also talks about how such a character becomes implanted in our collective consciousness through digital interactions such as memes, and later becomes a part of our cultural history. Bob also touches on the concept of acceleration, which he later expands upon in part 2. For now, though, I hope you enjoy part 1. Welcome to the podcast, Bob.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm so happy to be talking with you. It's such a pleasure. We're going to be talking about all things weird, and I'm so happy. I'm so looking forward to this. I've been kind of out of the running for a little bit, forced out of the running due to my voice issues, but hopefully everything will go well today. So welcome again.
Oh, well, thank you. And I just want to say it was a bit of an honor to be invited on to your podcast. I mean, my first thought was like, wow, wonderful. And then my second thought was, why? Yeah. But no, it's because obviously you've had many wonderful guests, and so asking me, I was kind of like, okay, a quasi-academic from the Council of State, all the way up in Iceland, it's 10 a.m. and it's still dark outside.
Yeah.
And I'm like, but hopefully I will not disappoint.
Oh, of course you won't disappoint. I mean, reading your work and talking with you, the little time that I was able to talk with you, I knew that it was going to be a great conversation.
Yeah.
So, even though you're working on your PhD now, the basis for this interview is your master thesis titled, quote, "I am an other and I always was, on the weird and eerie in contemporary and digital cultures," end quote. And I love that title, "I'm an other and I always was." I thought that was great. So this thesis discusses the aesthetic concepts of the weird and the eerie and how these have helped to fuel the social imagination, as well as how we can think about, quote, fiction and, quote, reality, among many other things. And you sent me that message this morning about looking it over and not recognizing anything that you had written, and I could relate to that.
Yeah. I think it's if you are in academia and you go back to some of your earlier writings, you kind of go like, I don't remember writing any of this. It feels like a fever dream, almost crafty, and I'm merely a carrier for alien forces,
Yeah.
Which my Benedict Jackson will just give me that look, going, "Oh God, here we go."
Well, we're going to get through this. We're gonna remember everything perfectly. I have my notes, and I'm sure your memory will come back to you about everything. So let's maybe start with our definitions, of course. So that's what we have to do in academia. What are we talking about? What are you talking about? I guess I should ask you. When you use the terms weird and eerie, and then these associated concepts of the Gothic and the uncanny. So if we can kind of get an idea of what it is that we're talking about, then we kind of make ourselves a framework for our later discussion. We can expand on all of this.
So yeah, just for those who aren't aware, I graduated with a master's in cultural studies in 2020, and it was about the weird and the eerie. So for the basis of my thesis, I took the last published book, by Mark Fisher, his 2017 book, The Weird and the Eerie, which was a collection of essays that kind of go all the way back to his early days when he was blogging under the name of K-Punk. And, throughout his entire life, he was kind of fascinated by kind of these aesthetic registers, which he came to, talk about things such as what is weird and the eerie. Because also one of his big projects was about the idea of the social imagination and about how contemporary capitalism and through the neoliberal project had effectively colonized the social imagination to the extent that we can't imagine any alternatives to it. The idea being that we can imagine the end of world before the end of capitalism, which is an oft-quoted piece. And so he starts to look at ideas of where there's these eruptions of different aesthetics and different ontological standpoints through culture that allows us to think differently. And one of these things is the idea of the weird and the eerie. So basically, very simply, the weird has its own kind of history, which goes all the way back to the ideas of weird fiction. So the idea here is that this has its roots definitely in things such as famously H.P. Lovecraft, and people like Algernon Blackwood, Arthur Machen, the era of Weird Tales magazine from the late 19th century up to about 1940 or so. But then people have argued that there was this what's called the New Weird, which was coined by the writer M. John Harrison. To, for example, talk about China Miéville, but also things such as Jeff Van der Meer, Clive Barker, Thomas Ligotti. And the idea here is that these are kind of like hybrid literary genres, that it's they're kind of like speculative fiction, where they take our empirical world and imbue it with, shall we say, beings, powers that's alternative to what we consider the familiar. And this is where, shall we say, that Fisher comes in, because Fisher then basically argues that at the heart of the weird is effectively that, how would you describe it here? It's something which does not belong. It is an eruption of the inside of our secular world with something from the outside. And this thing from the outside does not belong. And it cannot be contained or explained. So Fisher argues that, he basically says that this eruption from the outside, it can be material, it can be aesthetic, and it's something that's unexplainable or indescribable. But he argues that while this can be quite horrific, or give us, it's not just horror or dread, but at the heart there's a fascination to the weird, which he calls the jouissance. My French is terrible here. And there's a sense of wrongness here with the weird. He argues that this conviction that this thing does not belong, but it's also a sign that we're in the presence of something new and unexplainable, and that previous rational concepts and ideas have been rendered obsolete because they cannot explain this thing. And so he puts this not kind of as discrete boundaries, but like a kind of a spectrum. So in our society, we can argue that, where we sometimes sense or feel things or come across stuff which is off kilter, something which there's something kind of wrong. We call it we call all sorts of things glitches in the matrix, for example. And in his book, he, for example, does famously, he talks about Lovecraft, but he also talks about British post-punk such as The Fall. He talks about, let's see if I'm trying to remember here, Tim Powers. He's a weird fiction. And then he talks for this about the weird, and then it's kind of its partner, which is the eerie, which is even more kind of ephemeral and fleeting, because what the eerie here is that it's something more abstract and strange, and it's to do with presence or the metaphysics of presence. And the eerie can be boiled down to the idea of this presence, that maybe, the idea is that where there is supposed to be nothing, there is something, or where there should be something, there is nothing. And the idea here is that he argues that the eerie is constituted by a failure of absence or by a failure of presence. So, for example, you can have something like the Easter Island statues, where there's this thing, there's these heads in an island in the middle of nowhere, and it's like they shouldn't be there, but they're there, and it's like, well, how did they get there? Nobody knows. And we can come up with speculations of how all these stones got brought across many hundreds of kilometers of water, but it's hard. It's a mystery. But we also see it, for example, in things like in abandoned buildings, abandoned hospitals or abandoned farmhouses in the wild, in the woods, and also what's here is that this can lead to descriptive terms such as an eerie silence or an eerie cry. So the idea here is that there's this issue. It's a question of presence. That's a problem. And at its heart, the weird and the eerie, and this is where it comes into the idea of things like the uncanny. The weird and the eerie often kind of get used as synonyms with the uncanny. But the problem here is that the eerie, especially the eerie, is often not located in human confines like the home or the locales of the family. they're in marginal spaces, so where there's often a certain lack of human presence, such as, an abandoned building or a deep, dark forest or a wild moor a remote moor in the middle of nowhere. And so what he puts here is that it's a question of agency. The question of agency here is, and here's a quote that he has, is that it's about the forces that govern our lives and the world. And in the case of a failure of absence, the question concerns the existence of agency. Is there an deliberative agent here at all? Are we being watched by an entity that has not yet revealed itself? In the case of the failure of presence, the question concerns the particular nature of the agent at work. And then he argues that we know that Stonehenge has been erected, so the questions of whether there was an agent behind its construction or not does not arise. What we have to reckon with are the traces of a departed agent whose purposes are unknown. So you see, this gets into things like ancient aliens and all sorts of weird ephemera. But the thing here is that in terms of the uncanny, is that, when you think about the famous essay by Freud on the uncanny, is that he talks about, if I remember correctly here, is that it talks about E.T.A. Hoffman and the Sandman. And the idea here is that this is a psychological concept. So the uncanny, he equates, Freud equates with the word the unheimlich, which is the negative of Heimlich, which is the familiar, the homely. And Freud declares that the uncanny is unfamiliar, unhomely. And when in his analysis of the Sandman, there are instances of doubling, automatism, where inanimate objects or automations seem to have a life of their own. But Fisher critiques this in his book and in other writings, where Freud is attempting to kind of do an analysis on Hoffman. So he reduces, the fear of losing one's eyes to castration anxiety. And he basically tries to kind of do this move where bringing the outside into the inside. So it's this, so the idea here is that, if I remember correctly, I'm trying to remember here from, this idea that it's trying to kind of rationalize the weird and the eerie into the idea of the uncanny, that it brings it into the familiar and the homely. And what Fisher argues is that this is not possible, and it's an eruption from the outside. So hence why Lovecraft is an exemplar of such. I hope this makes sense. I was trying to remember all this straight off from the scratch this morning, but essentially that is what the weird and the eerie is. And I used this as a kind of a leaping off point to look at where the weird and the eerie erupts in contemporary societies. So in my master thesis, I looked at a case of the weird in the case of the Slender Man, our first digital folk devil or folk legend. And then I looked at the eerie into kind of the writing and work of J.G. Ballard. So yeah, it was definitely a weird ride in terms of researching this.
Well, it sounds, from my perspective, it sounds super interesting, but I like the weird and the eerie things. So this is right up my alley. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you about all of this, because I was very curious to hear your ideas about all of this. So mentioned the Slender Man. We're going to get into that more in just a moment. But another very important area of discussion that flows from the first discussion here concerns the boundaries between what we perceive as, quote, fiction and, quote, reality. Because you were talking about, presence and agency, and these are things, the unheimlich and all of that, we're things that are either familiar or unfamiliar, or, how are we determining this? And when it's explicitly said, no, this is a fiction, And yet things are happening in our empirical reality that are making us think, well, maybe this isn't really truly a fiction. How are we distinguishing between these two things? So let's talk about how it has become more difficult for us to discern between fiction and real. And of course, there's so much to unpack here. So I'm going to let you tackle this how you would like to tackle it. But I think when we get into things, well, your thesis, of course, gets into the ideas of postmodernism and Baudrillard and the concept of simulacra and all of these things. But however you would like to open this discussion, that's fine with me. But yeah, for me, it's this question of, it's become more difficult for us to know. And what do you think about that?
Well, I think this, I think you've hit the nail on the head, because in my thesis, I did argue that, from the Age of Enlightenment, the Enlightenment era, the dominant mode for critical thinking and examining the world around us has been basically one of reason. And so we have, the idea of the use of empiricism, of scientific rationale, the deployment of facts and logic, and skepticism to the world around us, also to belief systems from things like religion, but also things like the divine right of the monarchy. And so what happens is that this leads to things like the secularization thesis, or the disenchantment thesis of Max Weber. So the idea here is that, scientific reason and rationality become the dominant way in which we determine value. But the value here is things like facts, truth, and these come to create reality. So the idea, the real, is that which can be explained by the laws of science, and the value of facts and their truth can be deduced by objective and replicable means, to quote the panagraph. But that thing then is that religion, supernatural phenomena, or natural philosophy, gets relegated or demoted to being fiction or superstition, and this then becomes the realm of the irrational. And if you know anything about the history of esoteric traditions, if you read what's been happening in the academic field, is that the esoteric, on one point is being attacked by its institutional religion as heresy, but then comes the rise of the Age of Enlightenment, where it then argues that this is just irrationalism, superstition. But then what happens is that the age of modernity and subsequent historical epochs, they contain the seeds for its own undoing, shall we say? If you look at kind of the aesthetics of modernity, there is, people think it's postmodern, but it actually has its definite roots in modernity. This exploding of points of view. So there is no one determinate perspective on reality. There is also this we might call, through avant-garde art and modernist literature, things like derealization of the world, where the external world becomes subsumed to our internal forces, our psychological states, so to speak. And then at the same time, we have this explosion in technological mass culture. So what happens here is that things such as cinema, radio, television, and then digital technologies, it creates what could be called a supernaturalization of everyday life. They basically, it creates, it copies, our memories become external to us. We see the world more and more through images of cinema screens, of televisions, they come to create a stand-in for our memories, our history, and then or a form of prosthetic memory. And so the problem here is that, then what happens is that what becomes our memory, therefore our reality, becomes a lot more malleable. And this is where we start talking about things like the postmodern turn. And so very simply, in my thesis, what's happening here is that with postmodernism, it gets into a huge argument about what it is and what it isn't. You have it can be a historical period, which people generally argue happens after post-World War II. But then there's also postmodern aesthetics. And so the idea here is that you have what, I argue was three things: the decline and erosion of meta-narratives. So not only religion, but also of science. And so the idea is that you have this skepticism to this kind of domination of singular narratives which come to create our worldview, which therefore is our reality. And so the idea is there's this multitude of different viewpoints and histories. Then you get a shift in our economic and social worlds to capitalism, where there's a shift in the global north from the creation of goods and manufacturing heavy industry to an informational economy. It goes from the material to the immaterial. And so the idea here is that it goes more into the creation of signs and symbols. And then, of course, this is facilitated by the ubiquity of new media and digital technologies. This allows for this acceleration of the reproduction of the sign. And this is where Jean Baudrillard comes in. Baudrillard, he's a fascinating character. He was part of that 70s school of French thought, although he was an outlier within kind of French thinking. But he was alongside people like Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, who wrote the double-volume Capitalism and Schizophrenia. And then you have Jean-Francois Lyotard, who wrote The Libidinal Economy. And what Baudrillard did was he starts off by being a communist or a Marxist, but as he's examining the world around him, he feels that classical theory is becoming untenable in this increasingly mediatized, corporatized world. And he argues essentially that in such texts like It's Symbolic Exchange and Death and Simulation and Simulacra, which came out in 1981, that society doesn't organize itself around the production of goods and commodities based on needs and wants, but it becomes more about the exchange value. It becomes a world of simulation, a play of images and signs and symbols. And this creates what we call simulacra. And very simply, what happens here is that, when you create images, whether it's paintings or photography, that there is kind of an indexal relationship with what we call the real, that there is this reality that we have. But in Baudrillard's world is that these signs and symbols, whether it's logos or news media images or just products or objects, is that they don't have there's no link to an actual real. The simulation now comes in to stand in for the real. So it's no longer a question of reality and fiction, because what happens here is that the real kind of whittles away and disappears, and we live in a world of hyper reality, where the problem is it's not a question of is this real or not, but artificialness is impossible to fake now. And so what happens here is that, just thinking about this, is that you see this not just in Baudrillard, but we see it as well with the situationists, which were a group of radical thinkers and artists in France, like from the late 50s through to the 70s. And if you've ever read Marcus Grail's Lipstick Traces, he talks about these. And, they called it the spectacle, where they take Marx's idea that social relations are mediated through economic relations, they take it a step further and say, well, no, all social relations are mediated by images, signs, and symbols. And the idea here is that that dichotomy between reality and fiction, between the real and the artificial, these boundaries tend to dissolve. And, so we have this idea of the fictioning of reality, or the realization that what we call reality was made up of fictions in the first place. But meanwhile, there is this kind of also this fiction, not just this fiction of reality, but then fiction itself becomes helps to drive reality in that sense, if that makes any sense. And so this leads to in my thesis to Baudrillard's concept of theory fiction, which in itself we call from simulation theory. And so yeah, very simply, theory fiction. This is kind of like a soup top, or kind of an evolution of what you might call speculative fiction. Okay, and so the idea here is that if you look in the academy, or look at academic theory or critique, is that the idea is that we're meant to pierce the veil or lift the veil on the spectacle, and we see the underlying structures of power and domination. But if what Baudrillard says is that we live in a hyper-real world and there's no longer a quote-unquote real, and we just live in the world of simulation, then theory itself is untenable in that sense. It itself is a fiction, okay? And we realize that fiction, reality powers fiction, meanwhile fiction kind of feeds into the real. And so he argues that we must look not to the academy for explaining the world around us, but in the world of art, in the world of literature. And he argued that we should think of critical theory as science fiction. And famously, he argues that the British writer J.G. Ballard is an exemplar, that his style of writing captured the world much better than any formal theory or philosophy. And this was picked up by groups such as the Cybernetic Cultures Research Unit, which was mentioned in my master's thesis and is a chapter in my PhD. But this is where the idea that that fiction becomes a carrier upon which ideas can be explored. But here's the key to it, and this is where it gets really interesting in esotericism studies. If you've ever read things like the writings of Aaron Rukama, and he very recently uploaded here the draft of his chapter to this forthcoming collected edition on contemporary esotericism on speculative fiction. If you look at the modes such as weird fiction, science fiction, the Gothic, and horror, esoteric thinkers and people involved with theory fiction use these genre modes and forms of fiction. But these genre modes themselves have their roots in esoteric traditions and currents. And so what happens? So the idea here is that this then comes into the realm of, these become the realm of magical thinking. If we think of writing and reading as a form of magical action, we're now moving into the realm of the magical, and so that's when we're looking into things like Philip K. Dick, H.P. Lovecraft, and J.G. Ballard, who on the surface many people would not consider to be esoteric in their worldview or occultist. But I argue both in my master's and in my PhD thesis that you can make an argument that Ballard is a very esoteric writer. So. How is it looking, sounding so far to you? Are we going way off into the woods? You
No,
know?
not yet. Not in my mind anyway, but there's just so much. I mean, just
Yeah.
in this past 5 minutes, the things that you've mentioned, there's just so much to talk about. So it's like, where do I go from here? Because
So,
what point do I like want to bring up again? I
so the,
think
yeah. So the writer, for example, Mark Fisher, I argue, because in his PhD thesis, Mark Fisher really leans into cyberpunk and Baudrillard. Baudrillard was a big influence on cyberpunk, where one of the themes in cyberpunk is the blurring of the virtual and the material, and the blurring of reality and fantasy through cyberspace. But the idea that the simulation is more real than real itself, and he basically points that the that Fisher says, this the expansion into fiction into theory has an ambivalent effect upon theory. If theory can no longer be distinguished from fiction, if fiction can perform theory, and theory must then become fiction, so it's the idea of map and territory. So the idea here is that we enter into this kind of cybernetic loop where where fiction and reality feed on each other, where they inform each other. And then the realization that what Ballard points out is that we live in a world of fictions of every kind, which I talk about in my PhD thesis. He argued he did an essay in 1971, and this was way before cyberpunk or the CCRU, or even a decade before Baudrillard even cottoned onto this. He basically argued that in a world driven by consumer capitalism, that the literary writer is no longer the singular bearer of artistic genius in the production of a fictional world, because our entire world, through advertising, through mass media, through politics, it's just, we're living in a world where the writer is just one cog in a whole machine that's filling our environment with fictions of every kind. And then, so the whole idea is that institutions, be it political, economic, or cultural, they seek to alter or change what we would call consensual reality. And so what happens is fictions then get absorbed by the public through its interaction with mass media. So Ballard then advocated science fiction, both as a genre and as a mode of reading, as the only possible realization, or possible realism, in an increasingly artificial society. And this then gets into really weird, because when he did an introduction to the French publication of Crash, he gets really into the realm of the magical, So he basically says here that we live in a world ruled by fictions of every kind. Mass merchandising, advertising, politics conducted as a branch of advertising, the instant translation of science and technology into popular imagery, the increasing blurring and intermingling of identities within the realm of consumer goods, and the preempting of any free or original imaginative response to experience by the television screen. We live inside an enormous novel. For the writer, it is less and less necessary for them to invent the fictional content of the world. The fiction is already there. The writer's task is to invent the reality. In the past, we have always assumed that the external world around us has represented reality, however confusing or uncertain, and that the inner world of our minds, dreams, hopes, ambitions are represented the realm of fantasy and the imagination. These roles, too, it seems to me, have been reversed. The most prudent and effective method of dealing with the world around us is to assume that it's a complete fiction. And conversely, the one small mode of reality left to us is inside our own heads. So when you listen to that, you are basically talking about magic. You're talking about magical thinking. You're talking about the ideas that our imaginations can create forms of reality, which then go out into the outer world, which itself is a fiction and can infect our external world. So, in a sense, the fiction of our imagination can go out there and effect actual change. And he wrote this back in the 70s. So, yeah, so you realize very quickly you go down an incredible rabbit hole of, speculative fiction, theory fiction, and you just realize that there is a power within fiction. And this is what groups like the Cybernetic Cultures Research Unit glommed onto, and they argue that, through a series of essays that they wrote, was that fiction has a power that is often disavowed, because it's fiction. Fiction isn't real, and they, through terms like concepts like hyperstition, through their own writing, and through the use of people such as Lovecraft, William Burroughs, and to a lesser extent people like Ballard, they utilize the circuits of fiction, of literary fiction and genre fiction, to, in effect, perform changes in the world around us. How does that sound?
It sounds absolutely fabulous, and you're doing a wonderful job of explaining this. And you're circling back to to your feedback loops and infection, and you just mentioned it now, hyperstition. I talked with Rowan Cabrales in podcast episode 4 about hyperstition. We talked about it a little bit more in episode 8 when I did the Hellier Roundtable with Thomas van Breda. And at that point, I noticed a lot of feedback from those episodes about not really fully understanding this concept of hyperstition. So if we can maybe sit with this for a little bit and talk about this, because you mentioned in your master thesis that this could be seen as a distilled form of simulacra. So here we got the link between Baudrillard and simulacra. Now we're going into this idea of hyperstition. So when I was first introduced to this concept and all of these ideas, I was also just sitting there with my mouth open, not really fully understanding what it is. But as you go along, as you keep reading, as you keep thinking about it, then it starts to become more understandable. So hopefully this podcast episode will also contribute to this understanding. So history of hyperstition. You mentioned CCRU. Let's just get into it.
Okay. Okay. So I will try not to cover too much of the ground that our mutual friend Rowan covered when she covered in her chat with you about hyperstition. But I think, because obviously when in that podcast episode, there was a lot of talk about temporal anomalies and circuit, stuff like this. I think very quickly, the best way, and I heard Ed Berger, who is a kind of a blogger and a writer, in a podcast episode, he kind of nailed it very simply that hyperstition is very much the science of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay. And so he argues that it's modeled, on the feedback loops processes of fictioning. So it's kind of cybernetics, where the outputs of fiction feed into our cultural circuits, which then kind of alters our the structures and social systems of belief. And so what Ed Berger points out is that, as we mentioned, we live in fictions of every type. And he mentioned that Marx, for example, points out that capitalism is a social fiction. It's an abstraction that presents itself as real. And what happens is, in the critique of capitalism, is that in the realm of, it becomes less a superstition and becomes ideology. How it moves from being something which is a social fiction, it becomes real in the minds of people, to the point that a lot of Marx's writings, especially things like commodities and commodity fetishism, takes on the metaphor of religion. We imbibe in it at a level of belief to the point where we now talk of capitalism as this ironclad, immutable law of nature. It is common sense. It is the natural order of things. And this is what Mark Fisher was writing about in his observation and critique of capitalism, that it also almost becomes Gnostic in nature. He argues that this idea of capitalism has so expanded our immanent world, that including our own heads, that we cannot imagine any outside to this. And through its archons of ideology and through the technicians of capital, that we are creating this world which seems to be reality, even though it is itself a fiction. But so the CCRU think about this, but what they do very differently is that they talk about this idea of hype, of the investment that people place on brands, events, objects, entities, and it in itself doesn't require belief on our part. I think Ron mentioned this idea of unbelief, and so you can see about it in like capitalism, but you can also see about it in more recent phenomena, like in the financial market, or things like the Fire Festival, where like with GameStop, where that thing of like, well, there's a hype train where you don't actually have to believe in it, but you end up taking part in it by talking about it, by circulating memes and images. And what happens is that something that is fictional or social fiction takes on a life or reality of its own. This reality doesn't have to be material.
Right.
I mentioned the Fire Festival. If anyone has ever seen, Netflix documentaries or stories about it, for a while, this was going to be like the music lifestyle festivals to end all festivals. It was going to leave Burning Man for dust. And everybody bought into it. It was going to be this incredible thing. All these celebrities hop on board, all these influencers, and these influencers then start talking about it more, and they start to, create this momentum where the Fire Festival for a while becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But then, of course, it hits the reality principle of our material world, and it fell apart. But if you think about Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, they talk about materialism not in the sense of that way, but in terms of more the virtual and the actual. And so you don't necessarily have to have a physical materialism for this reality. And so that's very simply what it is. I think what we'll mention is, like, I think Ron mentioned this, is that the CCRU kind of builds upon this in a series of essays.
Yeah.
And in particular is the essay Lemurian Time War. Yes, the now famous idea. Now, what they points out to here is that, they add in ideas, that their own characters that the CCRU creates, these hyperstitional carriers, these kind of personas, such as Peter Visparov or Chitna Stillwell or Oscar Sarkon, with which they can imbibe, they can, through the hive mind of the CCRU, the people involved, will give a voice, almost creating like a thought form, and then just releasing them out there and see how much hype can these characters generate. And so the idea here is that they effectively create this idea of an incident where, if I remember correctly here, is that in the story of Lemurian Time War, you have this situation where I think this guy Kay, if I remember correctly, William Kay, and he approaches the CCRU and says that there was an incident involving William Burroughs in 1958, were perusing the secret or the occult library of Peter Visperov, he comes across this book containing the story Ghost Lemurs of Madagascar, which is a 1988 text that Burroughs is yet to write, but is there in front of him. But the manuscript is dated 3 centuries earlier. And then this sends Burroughs into this weird fugue state. This kind of his, the reality studio around him starts to crumble. And then the idea here is that from here, that Burroughs, from this moment, has been conducting a clandestine time war against what Burroughs would call the one God universe. Yes, and essentially what the one God universe comes to stand in for, the idea of the technocracy, the idea that there is this overarching fiction that, how do you describe it? I've got it here. It builds its monopolistic dominion upon the magical power of the word. And what happens is like this is like a stand-in for institutional religion, for capitalism, for the technocratic ideals of industrial modernism. Because, Alan Zizek, first off, it tries to put itself as, this is not an ideology, this is not a fiction. It masks its own fictionality. It puts itself as the only reality in existence. And as part of this, it will subsume smaller or competing fictions, into its own body, or metaphysical body. And then, this is the idea of recuperation, or co-option. And so the idea here is that even when, alternative reality systems then get marked maybe as part of its own mythos. So the idea of evil, versus good, and so the idea is that the one God universe works through fictions to repudiate its own fictional status. It's basically it's Plato's cave, effectively, and so what happens here is that from this moment where he comes across his own text that he is yet to write, but the text itself is dated back 3 centuries earlier, with if I remember correctly, regarding this pirate who discovers and creates this Libertania colony on Madagascar. This basically short circuits the one God universe and the circuits of control in Burroughs, and he starts to see the world for as it actually is, and therefore he understands that it is through fiction, it is through writing that and what the CCRU argues is that there's this kind of this low-level disinformation campaign that gets put across through academia, for example, that labels Burroughs as a postmodern writer, or that his writing is aesthetic in nature, as opposed to functional. And the whole point here is that his Burroughs' writing is functional, therefore it is magical, because the functionality of it through things like the cut-up and through the use also of the cut-up in terms of sound is there to destabilize the overriding reality studio, so to speak, or the reality program. And this is where you get this nexus between, and this is part of my PhD thesis, this nexus between the CCRU and contemporary occultism, such as chaos magic, because and this is from the Lemurian Time War. In order to work, the ODU feeds on belief. In order to work, the story that runs on reality has to be believed, which is to say, the existence of a control program determining reality must not be suspected or even believed. Credulity in the face of the ODU meta-narrative is inevitably coupled with a refusal to accept that entities like control have any substantive existence, which therefore he says, this is why to get out of the reality program, there must be a systematic shedding of all beliefs as a prerequisite, which is, for example, a core theme of chaos magic, is this antinomian shedding of all established norms, habits, and belief systems. And what they do, though, is they critique postmodernism, because they argue that postmodernism is just merely this continuation of representational reality, is that they place fiction in this metaphysical frame where it's this nice object that can be gazed upon but has no power. And this is the idea, the idea that the academy tries to frame Burroughs as a postmodern writer or an aesthetic writer, as opposed to a magician who works through the word, who works through writing. And, so the idea here is that the term of nothing is true, everything is permitted. What they say is that they caution that it's not the postmodern relativism of nothing is real. On the contrary, they argue, nothing is true because there's no single authorized version of reality. Instead, there is an excess. There are multiple competing realities. And so what you then get here is that where magic and sorcery and esoteric worldview can come to destabilize what they call the one God universe. So that's the background of hyperstition, right?
Right.
That's the background to it. So it's the idea here is that our world is made up of fictions, and our fictions therefore come to stand in and become reality. So they're no longer thought of as fictions. To us, they are the reality. That's the power of fiction. Mm-hmm. And so then once you realize this, you can use fictions to create, I call them like little IED devices that can erupt maybe years after the writing to effect or destabilize established cultural and social norms. And so what if I find it here is that there are several different ideas here. You have people, for example, like Alex Williams, when he talks about it, he says this: narratives able to effectuate their own reality through the workings of feedback loops, generating new socio-political attractors. But the CCRU talks about it as 1, an element of effective culture that makes itself real; 2, a fictional quantity functional as a time-traveling device; 3, a coincidence intensifier; and 4, a call to the old ones, which is very esoteric in its own point. But what I did was in my master's thesis, I said, right, let's take this model and apply it to a real life incident, and which was the Slender Man.
Yes.
So this is kind of a really roundabout way. We're already an hour in, and we're only now talking about the Slender Man. So
but this is good. I like the roundabout. So, okay, so Slender Man, in everything that you've just set up until this point, you were talking about, the fictions as being this thing that couldn't affect us, couldn't touch us because it wasn't real, and yet, we're in this idea of hyperstition, that everything is a fiction, and we're just operating on the assumption that certain fictions are actually real.
Yeah.
Then we can look at a case study of the Slender Man as this, and you mentioned also about the CCRU creating these characters and then putting it out there to see, what will happen. Yeah. With Slender Man, in this case, Slender Man is a entity, an image that was put out there, and then something happened. And then a lot of things happened. So maybe, I don't know. I don't know if the listeners are going to be familiar with who Slender Man is, how Slender Man came to be in our idea, in our heads, in our minds. So maybe a little bit of a background of Slender Man, and then we can get into the case study of how this is an example of hyperstition.
Okay. So So yeah, the Slender Man. I mean, when I was writing my master's thesis, this was like 2019, 2020, and Slender Man had already become part of our pop cultural psyche. It's argued, for example, as the internet's first folk devil or folk legend.
Right.
And so, um, I think we'll kind of work as I did my thesis. I'll work backwards first off. So
Okay.
the public's imagination, it starts off as a moral panic because in 2014 in Wisconsin in the US, these two girls, Anissa Wire and Morgan Geyser, and they're two 12-year-old girls. And they take their friend, who was a girl called Peyton Leutner, into the local woods nearby their town. And then once they get into the woods, Bayer and Gazer attack Leutner and they stab Leutner 19 times and they leave her for dead. But miraculously, Leutner survives this attack and she manages to gain help. And there was, the two girls were arrested shortly afterwards and the case became like a media spectacle. Because what happened is that when they were interviewed by the police, they basically said that in their defense, they were attempting to kill Leutner to curry favor and gain grace with an entity they called the Slender Man. And then all of a sudden came this massive panic, of like, what is the Slender Man? And, and then, of course, it was like, they found this on the internet. Do you know what your child is doing on the internet? Which is, it has elements of moral panics going way back to the realms of the Gothic Penny Dreadfuls, EC comics and the comics, moral panic, video nasties, and the satanic panic. So yeah, this is
Dungeons and Dragons.
Exactly. Yeah. So what is the Slender Man? So, and so what happened is that obviously what happened is that we rewind back to 2007. And so what happened in 2007, there's this kind of, the internet, social media is just starting to pick up, okay? And so what you have here is that there was this forum site called somethingawful.com. And in 2009, there was a kind of a forum topic called Create Paranormal Images. So the members of the forum were challenged to upload real images, photoshopped images to show the existence of ghosts or supernatural phenomena, which, as we all know in esoteric studies, there's been a long relationship between, the use of, media technology and the capturing of the ephemeral. Of ghosts, of apparitions, of a spiritual nature.
Yeah.
And so a week or so passes, nothing much happens. But then after about 10 days, there was a user called Victor Surge, whose real name was Eric Knudsen. He uploads two photoshopped images. And so the first image is of a group of teenagers that are kind of walking or running away from something in the distance. And they look quite stressed or, they're kind of a bit, fearful. And then and then in the rear, you see this figure and the features are blurred. But again, it's this tall stick-like figure in the background. And it seems like the kids are trying to run away from said figure. And then the second image is like a simple image of children playing in a kind of a nursery school playground. And they're all in the foreground, but in the shadow of a tree in the far background, there's this tall, mysterious, tall figure in a kind of a black suit, which seems to have tentacles for arms, and in the background, you see some children kind of congregating around him. And for example, on that, there's a kind of a little blurb or text alongside it saying, one of two recovered photographs from the Stirling City Library blaze, notable for being taken the day on which 14 children vanished, and for what is referred to as the Slender Man. Deformity cited as film defects by officials. Fire at library occurred 1 week later. Actual photograph confiscated as evidence. And this was by, and it's got here, 1986, photographer Mary Thomas, who has been missing since June the 13th. So from these two images, all of a sudden, a few more images of the Slender Man by the user Victor Surge gets uploaded. And then what happens is that more images get this, as kind of this cycle starts to take a momentum of its own. And then another user called Thuro Up, a play on throw up, but Thuro. I know, it's internet humor, it's wonderful. Says that he finds a reference to the Slender Man in 16th century folklore and provides a screen capture of a translated story. And it has an image of the Slender Man in like a woodcut, like 16th century woodcut art. And then more users then find, I see this image of the Slender Man in this old Romanian folktale. And then what happens is the snowball effect starts coming.
Yeah.
And then over the case of weeks and months, the Slender Man burst out from the Something Awful forum onto YouTube and Reddit, and then eventually onto Twitter. But then it then starts taking a life of its own. There then becomes these YouTube web series. There were 3 in total. One was called Everyman Hybrid. One was called Tribe 12, and then the most famous one was called Marble Hornets. And this was the idea here was that a user on the Something Awful forum said that this is the premise, is that his school friend Alex was working on a student film titled Marble Hornets. But then after several weeks of filming, Alex becomes agitated, antisocial, fearful, and then abandons them. And then one day, this user, Seagars, he calls himself, receives this package full of all the tapes from the making of this film and instructing him that he should burn them. But Seagars then, or he's known as Jay, then proceeds to watch these films. And then what happens here is that as you see more and more of these tapes, which get uploaded onto the YouTube series, you start seeing that his friend Alex comes into contact with the Slender Man. And this is where it really takes off. The Slender Man starts, spreading as throughout a lot of these internet forums, subcultures, and then eventually it burst through in 2014, up to this Wisconsin stabbing. But then it breaks out into other things. Even before that, there was Slender Man becomes this independent video game. There was 2 actually. There was called Slender: The 8 Pages and Slender: The Arrival. And then after the stabbing incident and the moral panic, there are these documentaries such as the HBO documentary Beware the Slender Man, and then a series of these indie films and mainstream films about the Slender Man. Which they were not very good, I will say. They're bog standard, pop fair, C, B- grade movies, but from these 2 Photoshop images, through the kind of the circulation and memification that we get through social media and internet subcultures, Slender Man takes on a life of its own.
Yeah.
And so I applied the kind of the model of hyperstition and argued that the Slender Man was kind of a localized case of hyperstition. And so what I argued here is that, so first off, the first stage, which we say an element of effective culture that makes itself real. So what happens is that in this idea is that it's like a collective storytelling, okay? And so what happens here is that through this online form is that it goes into kind of what I might call open source storytelling or myth making. Yeah. Because then what happens is that it's what the CCRU called is the collectivization of the fictional system. So what happened is that people would upload their images, and people within the thread would go, that doesn't quite work, it doesn't. They should, the Slender Man shouldn't have a hat, or it shouldn't look this way.
Yeah.
What happens is that through this iterative feedback, this kind of like cybernetic feedback of storytelling, is that several of the main canon aspects happen. So very early on, the tentacles, they lose the tentacles. The Slender Man is faceless. It wears a black suit. When the arrival of the web series, for example, so it shows, for example, how you get slender sickness. So when encounters or exposure to the Slender Man results in coughing fits or nosebleeds, or electronic disturbances and noise, and glitching on your video camera. So when the Slender Man appears, or digital noise.
Yeah.
And so this is a collect. So what happens is that this cultural production becomes cybernetic. It's collective, and they kind of, it all feeds in on each other. And so this idea here is that they are effectively creating a legend, okay? And then what happens here is that they create the rules of it. So, and then this moves into the second part, which is a fictional quantity functioning as a time traveling device. So so a good example of this outside would be the case of, it's like a viral form of retconning. So, for example, a good case would be cyberpunk with Neuromancer. William Gibson, way before the internet or cyberspace becomes part of our lives, creates a fictional representation of cyberspace. But such is the power of the cyberpunk text that it implants itself on the mind of people. So cyberspace ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, so it's basically using, and this is where Rowan talked about the temporal loops, the non-linear feedbacking of back into cultural history. So things like The Matrix, The Terminator, 12 Monkeys. And so what happens, as I've mentioned, is that all of a sudden the people involved with creating the Slender Man mythos all of a sudden start finding him everywhere. They trace him back to Egyptian mythos in the 5000 BC, as I mentioned, the 16th century, with German folklore, Romanian folk tales. So they give it a sense of depth, a sense of myth. So it's breaking it free from a thread on the internet forum. But then they start seeing like, oh wow, he's everywhere. They link him to like the Tall Man from the Phantasm movies, the Gentleman Demons of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the Men in Black, even Jack Skellington from The Nightmare Before Christmas. They also bring in Lovecraft, but also Mark C. Daniel Lusky's tale House of Leaves. And so they, in the sense that they utilize different literary forms or narratives. So things like diary entries, police and medical reports, news articles, images, drawings, photographs. Okay, so what they're doing here is that they kind of infect cultural history with incidents of the Slender Man to go, the Slender Man has always been there. We've worked out who he was. That's a hyperstition. And then the stage 3 is the entity as a coincidence intensifier. So this is where the concept of unbelief, right, or the hype, or the phenomenon of hype. So it's intensifying the modes of circulation and feedback, and whether it's true or not, it's a question of transmuting fictions into truths. And so what happened here is that as it becomes like a meme, and as it gets spread out, so what was happening was, even though the Slender Man is thoroughly a constructed fiction, which you can map out from the very first post, what was happening was this specific subculture people, was that they found themselves, even though it was a fictional entity, they invest part of themselves within it. And so what they were doing was they were talking about like, wow, I'm just been walking through this dark path at night, and I'm seeing things in my peripheral vision. They were found they were having disturbed sleep patterns. They were kind of like, I'm walking into like a wooded area on my way home, and I'm getting this strange feeling. They're spooking themselves out, basically.
Yeah. And you're not referring to the girls in this incident that committed the crime. You're talking about other internet users, I guess you could say, on these forums that were talking about as they had been introduced and come, into contact with this story and this entity of the Slender Man. They started to notice different things happening to themselves.
Affect quality upon them. And it's also amongst the people who are creating the Slender Man themselves. They're creating this myth and they're freaking out about it.
Yeah.
They're creating a magical entity in a sense.
Yes. Yeah.
What I did was in folkloric studies, I looked to the writing of Jeffrey Tolbert, and he uses the concept I argue that Slender Man is the reverse of the concept of ostension, which is the acting out of narratives in reality. Sometimes harmlessly, or sometimes even in more extreme ways. And so, Tolbert argued that the Slender Man is part of a process that adds credence to the narrative powers as a legend. All right, so it becomes this metatextual fiction. But what they're doing is they're investing part of themselves in its creation. Therefore, even though it's self-consciously creating a fiction, its plausibility as a representative of the legend genre. So basically what it is that they're making the Slender Man legend seem like a legend, which has the power to, as we say, freak people out, And so the whole here is this immersion and participation in the mythos. And this is the kind of this cycle of memific hype that the CCRU is central to hyperstition. And then there's stage 4, a call to the old ones, where, through what we, so this idea that, where, and this is where we get Lovecraftian, hence a call to the old ones, that, as we through our technologies, through our ability to see beyond our perceptual framework of the human, we're able to go further out to the edges of the universe and go into subatomic distances. We're able to measure time to such an infinitesimal quality that what we might call the present, 1 second, is much closer to eternity than to this Planck's constant of time. And so the idea is that we're discovering the hidden dimensions of nature. This is the quote unquote outside erupting. This is the Lovecraftian idea where the monsters are not the irrational. This is the hyper rational in this sense. And so, we talk about this in terms of, the hyper object, of financial capitalism or of Gaia, where the workings are just beyond our perceptual framework. Okay. So the idea here is that when it came to the Slender Man, I argued is that things like Marble Hornets, and its idea of the evil text or the circulation of new forms of media, this idea of this evil lurking underneath the outside lurking underneath the surface of everyday reality. This infects us, this eruptions, exposes the audience to these things which are unaccountable, aka the weird. Okay, so I mentioned before the moral panic and the media hype after this stabbing incident, and so this is the occult potentialities that lurks underneath the Slender Man. And the occultist and writer, Kat Vincent, argues that what they did when they created the Slender Man was effectively they created a mythical thought form, a tulpa.
Yeah.
You know, and this tulpa then ends up, or like the golem, ends up having a life of its own. It gets put out there through the circuits of social media and our virtual world, and it becomes actualized. And so so the idea of a Slenderman as a tulpa of modern magic is, it allows a space where both the Slenderman is both, quote unquote, able to exist and not exist. And this is the implicit aspect on the audience investing in it through the actions of the people on this internet forum, is that they give it a magical life, and then it just runs rampant through the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea then is like, well, what does that mean? It's an online textual phenomenon. It's part of a cultural process that's hyperstitional in nature. It was a fictional entity that became real or gained its own reality in the minds of many people. And it's basically what Mark Fisher called the agency of the virtual. And of course, he's talking about capitalism, but we see this now, that the Slender Man is symptomatic of where our own lives are spent in increasingly in a world where the virtual and the physical, the ontological boundaries are becoming more and more effaced. Okay? And we have, like, for example, we have our physical identities and our physical selves, but we have online identities, which sometimes are more real than our physical identities. And then what happens then is, we see it today. I mean, you hear a lot of talk about a post-truth world, where what you get here is the weaponization and the gamification of fictions. Okay, reality becomes a battlefield. Whether it's climate science or alternative facts, this, for example, we see it in in conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theory has been around for centuries. We also, for example, see how various states and institutions create fictions for ideological. So, for example, you had, in the US, in Soviet Russia, you had the Soviet realism movement. The rise of Nazism, there was an aesthetic equality, the aestheticization of Nazi politics with things like the triumph of the will. Meanwhile, liberal, capitalism is perpetuated through mass media, through Hollywood, through televisions, and these create these fictions that attempt to become realities in the minds of people. But what we have now is that politics, propaganda, and discourse through digital mass media and social media move faster. You can go from zero to reality in a flash, right. And you see it, we have seen it ourselves, from Pizzagate. QAnon, I think, is becoming the now method where it doesn't matter if you can show it's, the constructed nature of it, that doesn't matter.
No.
It's this unbelief. It perpetuates itself and it mutates. It brings in more and more other conspiracies and other people. And we know it's a fiction, and yet it's attained a life of its own, for worse. And this means that there is, it's not an epistical problem, but now from the late 20th into the 20th century, we have a problem of reality. And this is where esotericism and occultism now pops its head around the corner and going, hello, because that's the realm of occult practices, especially in our contemporary esoteric currents and traditions. So, and this is where my PhD project has been kind of really delving more into the idea of the accelerationism, as a heuristic and a concept, and about how when the explosion from the late 20th century of neoliberal capitalism, and it's fueled by this explosion in technological innovation, has led to this destabilizing of our world, reality, social relations, and this has led to certain occult groups and scenes such as Chaos Magic and the Cybernetic Cultures Research Unit to take on acceleration as a heuristic instead of trying to fight capitalism or circumvent it. It's coming to terms with it, embracing it from an esoteric standpoint, an esoteric worldview. And so this is where they start blending things like Lovecraft, Burroughs. Once they realize is that we live in a world mediatized by competing fictions, then you can storm, quote unquote, the reality studio, and you can use magic to effect changes on your reality from your internal imagination onto, quote unquote, external reality, which is a fiction anyway. So
right. Please join us for part 2, where Bob expands on accelerationism and its problems, how esoteric thought has influenced digital technology, as well as the connections to all of this to counterculture and New Age thought, plus much more, of course.